Ex-prisoners. What's the most disturbing thing you've seen or heard in prison? The worst for me were the dietary punishments. There was that court ruling years ago that Nutriloaf is not cruel, unusual punishment, and there's no requirement that prison food be appealing to eat as long as it's safe. So since then, these sort of punishments got worse and worse. If you weren't a model inmate, your food basically looked and smelled like stale canned cat food. They'd mix it with vinegar too to make it even harder to stomach. Story 2. I was in county jail, but in a rough part of Southern California. We had triple-stacked bunk beds and general population in just a large, open room. I had a middle bunk, and oftentimes at night, guys would try to stealthily jerk off. The bed shaking is a dead giveaway, and usually you just try to ignore it. Well, one night I'm reading and the bed started shaking vigorously, which is not how you do it. As I was putting my book down to tell this dude knock it off, he fell off his bunk and cracked his skull open on the concrete floor. He had a seizure on the top bunk and fell down about 7 feet straight to the concrete head first. That was a gnarly sight to see. Edit. I really didn't think this needed to be said since it's spelled out for you guys. He was not masturbating. The shaking from his bunk was the seizure, which led him to rolling off and landing head first. Story 3. Legit crazy people who not faking but schizophrenic or something else wrong. Feel sorry for them because other inmates will beat them up. Dude sitting there rambling to himself every waking moment and guards just let the nutcase in Gen Pop to irritate everyone until someone shuts him up. Lots of crazy people need to be somewhere else, but Gen Pop. Oh, and I was in group therapy and this dude had a ball in his hand when talking, and I figured it was like something he got from commissary. Don't think much of it. Then someone comes up to him holding a trash can. It was a ball of his own Schmidt. Story 4. Not me, but I know from friends in Africa that in their country, people caught poaching are often locked in a prison cell with a lion, separated by metal bars, of course. The lion is usually one being rehabbed and has plenty of room to move around. It's a huge cell, and 95% of it belongs to the lion. The inmate is put in a narrow strip against the wall. I thought that sounded like not much worse than regular prison, because the lion can't reach you, but they said until you've been in there, you can't imagine how terrifying it is. When you're close enough to a lion to smell its breath and see its glowing eyes at night and can't get away, the lion's food and water is put right against the separation bars, so it spends a good chunk of its time voluntarily near the criminal. When it's there, the inmate can't get more than 3 to 4 feet away from the lion. Story 5. Some of the behaviors from those suffering from mental health issues were pretty disturbing. Inmates covering themselves in fecal matter or smearing it all over their cell was not entirely uncommon. Saw an inmate cover himself head to toe and also bite wounds into his wrists and pack those with Schmidt. One inmate cut a testicle out and slapped it against the cell window when the co walked by. Story 6. Probably seeing the lengths people will go to in order to get opioid replacement therapy, like Bupay or Suboxone, in order to either sell to someone else or because they're being intimidated to give their dosage to someone. Inmates have to swallow the liquid in front of a guard and nurse, obviously, but they have figured out ways around this. Creating little paper catchments and sticking them in their throat, or just being empty-stomached and vomiting it up when they get back to their cells. Story 7. Spent a year at a minimum security prison farm in the South. I thought it would be a better experience due to less violence, but it's hell. I had to spend 50 hours a week cleaning huge pig barns and chicken coops, preparing slop for the pigs out of the most repulsive restaurant-charred grocery waste that was dumped on site every week. We got almost no visitors because we all stunk so bad. If you broke prison rules, you'd lose shovel privileges, which was its own special hell. You'd still get thin gloves to muck pig pens with to meet minimum safety requirements, but no shovel. New arrivals who were city boys, like me, often threw up a ton their first week. Story 8. I worked with an ex-prison guard. He said the worst thing he saw was a guy rolled up in a mattress being raped. The guy had obviously taken a beating and was screaming very bad. He stopped and asked if everything was okay, and they said yes, even though he knew it wasn't. Story 9. My relative, Russia, Soviet times mafia, told me that one of his cellmates used a mug and a nail and hammered his scrotum to a chair, just to get to the hospital to evade being killed. That's the spirit. Story 10. I used to be a correctional officer in Singapore, where judicial caning is still used as a punishment for certain crimes and prison offenses. I never had to carry it out myself, but I saw it plenty of times. Among the inmates, they would act like they're not scared of it, it's not a big deal, etc., to save face. But privately, in the caning room, they're caned in private, not in front of other inmates. I've never seen anything that can make hardened criminals break down and cry like the cane can. For those who don't know, it's a lot more severe than Sharia whipping used in many countries. That is more for humiliation, while caning is for causing maximum pain. I saw grown men cry, beg, plead, throw up, even pass out from the pain. They have to keep a doctor on hand. Smaller offenders who got 3 strokes would be okay, though, after a miserable week or two. Rapists who got the 24-stroke maximum, though, were never the same. Story 11. Witnessed a few people being beaten or stabbed to death, but one of the more weird things was a guy that would inject his bladder full with fake urine in order to pass drug tests. He'd use a sports bottle filled with urine-colored water and force the nozzle into the tip of his cock, and then relax, squeeze the bottle, lol. Story 12. Kettling is big in UK prisons. Mixing sugar and boiling water to make a napalm, like substance to throw or pour on people. Hands down, though, the worst thing I personally saw was when I worked as a violence reduction buddy. I talked to a man in isolation who had sliced himself all over with a razor blade and was rubbing his Schmidt into the cuts. Story 13. I've only ever been in jail, but I met one of my friends there who has been in and out of prison for a heroin addiction. And one of his most traumatic memories is helplessly listening to his friend being raped in the cell next to him while the guards did nothing. I also heard about a woman who was giving birth in her cell, begging to go to a hospital, but the guards didn't believe her and didn't get her any medical help until the baby was like halfway out already. If she had had complications, they probably would have both died. Story 14. I turned 21 in solitary confinement, was only put in for 2 weeks for passing contraband the guy next to me had been in for months. The windows are frosted so you can't see outside into the world. The guards come by twice a day and point a taser at you while they tear your cell up while you're naked. The screams at night from the guy in the cell next to me were so heartbroken. It didn't sound human at all. Just helplessness and sorrow. Sorry, I know you were looking for stories of fights and shankings, but the thing that disturbed me the most was listening to that man every night for those 2 weeks. Story 15. The prisons are filthy and poorly managed with no budget, so you're living in dirt with insects and rodents everywhere. There is the constant struggle of figuring out who wants to hurt you, extort you, or actually befriend you. Exceedingly rare if you're young, white, and unaffiliated. Hearing someone be beaten and raped after the doors are locked for the night in a 2-man cell dorm is a discomforting experience. So is seeing someone stabbed countless times by multiple people, or when the CIAs gang up on someone, handcuff them, then beat them with walkie-talkies, and spray them. Then they write it up like the inmate attacked them and their retaliation was warranted. Story 16, a really tragic story. My sister taught in a juvenile prison. There was a really troublesome juvenile inmate who would always brag that his uncle was the head of a gang in the adult prison next door. When the juvenile turned 18, he was transferred to the adult prison, and the uncle sold him to a rival gang. The boy was molested and raped repeatedly until he hung himself. Story 17, I had a cellie who had been in for 30 years. He was institutionalized. He had been in since he was 18, and he was almost 50. He was serving a life sentence for murder. Just knowing him was disturbing enough to give the soul chills. I can't describe the feeling. I walked on eggshells around him. He never did anything to me, but I knew one false move, and he could have easily killed me. He put me in fear. I know he knew it too. Story 18. Saw a guy warm up a coffee cup full of baby oil, and then walk up to another prisoner and threw it in his face. Dude's face looked like it was melting off because he tried to rub it off. The dude owed like $10 over some ramen noodles and said he wasn't going to pay. 2 things get you up in prison: debt and respect. Story 19. I worked at a jail for a few months. One guy started bragging about how his family dog kept barking at night. He said it wouldn't shut up, so he got up, hung the dog by the neck, and then beat it with a baseball bat to death. He did this right in front of his kids, who were screaming. He was genuinely laughing, telling us about this. I've met quite a few crazy people, but this guy literally made me sick. Story 20. In my city, not in the US, there is a policy that jail cells are supposed to stink to make it harder to endure. They change the odors every couple days, so you can't get used to it. I thought it was a joke, not a serious thing, until I had to spend a week in jail for simple assault. It's unbearable. I felt sick the whole time. I didn't know it would be that strong. I remember my cell being sprayed down with mink scent from a nearby mink farm, and it's just the grossest stuff ever. Story 21. Not me, but my aunt, who was convicted of a pretty serious white-collar crime, did time in a federal prison known for holding the worst of the worst violent female prisoners, which the popular TV series Orange is the New Black is based on. When she got out, all my cousins had a get-together at her place where she told us all her prison stories, and by far, the craziest one was about a woman who was in there for killing and cooking her infant child, then feeding it to her husband for having an affair. Story 22. not prison, but did a month in jail. My cellmate would steal the candy I bought from the commissary that I had hidden under my pillow when I was sleeping. I caught him once and we got into an argument. He threatened to rip off my head and schmitt down my throat. This same guy was also making pruno in our cell. When I found out about it, I told him to dump it out. He said he did, but he just packed soap around it and hid it to hide the smell. I dumped it out on him when he was in the shower. During the same stint, a guy from Solitary was brought into our block. He got in an argument with his cellmate about who has top or bottom bunk. Solitary confinement guy was about 6'3". Other guy was about 5'6". Other guy had just come from the shower, so only had a towel on with wet feet. Solitary guy threw one punch and absolutely laid him out. There was also a guy that came into our block that smuggled in Suboxone in his prison wallet. He schmitted out in the shower, which pissed a bunch of us off. When the guards found out, they started to take him out and he tried to make a run for it. Story 23. Working in maintenance. I saw everything. Inmates committing suicide, inmates getting bashed to death, officers having keks with inmates, officers having keks with other officers while on duty. Saw a female inmate being fisted like forearm sorta. A notorious pedo have boiling water thrown over him. Guys putting the inner of a pen up their penis. Coworker had a used tampon hit him in the face. Had a female inmate break free of 3 guards and rush me. Had a male inmate sneak up behind me with a shiv. Saw an inmate roundhouse a guard and knock him out. Did intercept a drug ring by accident. By far the worst was seeing a head count. They had them line up on the yard. 2 inmates were holding a guy up, like arms around him, like mate sort of thing. They finished the head count. The 2 inmates let go. He fell like a sack of potatoes. Ended up with massive brain injuries. The Schmidt I saw in Juvenile doesn't even compare. Now that place is terrible. Story 24. Once the lights went out, you'd start hearing scraping noises on the concrete. It was gang members sharpening their homemade knives on the concrete floor. Somebody was about to get killed when you heard that noise. Stuff straight out of hell. Story 25. I've been to jail, juvie and a J-doc, kiddie prison. My crazier stories are from juvie and J-doc, surprisingly. We had a kid in juvie who was given a 23-month sentence for stealing a car. He tried to kill himself by falling off the bunk, which is only like 1.5 feet high, and onto the toilet. I'm guessing he thought it would break his neck. All over 23 months. He ended up on suicide watch, where they put you in a single cell outside the guard room, and they have a camera on you 24/7. IDK how other juvies work, but in that cell is a button. You have to press to request, to move from the bed, use the toilet, etc. He ended up with a massive bump on his head, the size of a cantaloupe. I've seen a kid who was 15 go into juvie on his court date. He was given 6 years for committing armed robbery and assault with a deadly weapon. I've never seen somebody give up on everything in one moment, but that kid's teen years were done for. In J-doc, we had this kid named Junior who showed up and thought we were in a movie or something. First thing he did was try and fight one of the leaders of a gang, and he came to regret it quick. They all jumped on him and beat the schmidt-ar of him. For his entire sentence, not a day went by where he wasn't a punching bag for that gang. Any chance they got, they were him up. It got so bad, the DOs ended up putting him in isopod for his own safety. Story 26. Second night I was in, I heard officers screaming, disengage over and over, and I looked at my cellie who had been down for 20 years. For murder, what was going on? He told me that when they catch a couple of guys doing the deed, they scream that to get them to stop. This same cellie started to growl like a dog at my foot while I was laying on the top bunk, and then pretended to bite at my foot. When he did this, my toe went into his mouth, which caused him to gag. One time during count, these 2 guys started to make tattoo ink by burning baby oil, but they threw water onto it when it got too big, and it spread all over their cell. So they were locked in the cell with flames covering the walls, with them locked in it. They were about to get out in a couple of months, but ended up getting a 10-year sentence for arson after the incident. Story 27. My dad is a prison officer in a max prison in the UK. He says the worst is when a pedo is put with everyone else. Once the others hear about it, it's 100% guaranteed that the dude is going to be injured or killed, and the screws will take their time getting to them. He said the worst he's seen was a guy was put in for raping and killing a newborn. 20 minutes later, the dude had been sugared. Sugared is boiling water with sugar dissolved into it, so it's thick. Story 28. Seen 2 meth heads stay up for a week straight till one of them thought the other was plotting against them. So they made a blade out of a pencil sharpener and a pencil and cut the other guy's face up in the middle of the night. Before I left, they had him in maximum security with an attempted murder charge against him. Story 29. Wasn't in prison, but my last job involved representing employees of the prisons, correction officers, admin staff, doctors, nurses, etc., when they were sued by inmates. One day I was talking to a co-making small talk while on a visit to jail to investigate my case, and asked him a similar question. He asked, "What's the most crazy thing you saw?" BC. I was interested. Guy says he had a job once as a suicide cell watcher. Basically, when an inmate threatens suicide in that particular prison, he would go on suicide watch. Softer walls, paper clothes, no drawstring, so can't be made onto ligature, no shoes, nothing sharp. Glass cell doors, so an officer could watch him, etc. This officer says he was assigned to watch the glass doors of 2 cells for his 8-hour shift. So he's sitting there doing his job. Both inmates were in their bunks when all of a sudden he sees what he described as an ungodly amount of blood soaking the bed of one of the cells, dripping on floor. He said he saw it just spreading over the guy's sheets like a spill cleaned up W paper towels. He does what he is supposed to, calls backup, medical, etc. They go into the cell to try to save the inmate, CPR, etc., where they found the inmate with both wrists slashed deep. He's looking in the cell for a weapon or piece of metal, figuring the poor guy smuggled something into suicide watch. Nope, for faint of heart, you may want to stop reading here. Turns out, the inmate had worked his big toenail back and forth, until it loosened, and he was able to rip it off his foot completely. He then took the toenail and sharpened it on a small piece of exposed concrete on a wall behind the padding until it was sharp enough to cut. Then the inmate used it to open up his wrists in a suicide attempt. He had other crazy stories, and I heard plenty of others from guys over the years. I left that job for greener pastures after 10+ years, but left with 2 primary realizations. 1. Working in prisons is very hard and dangerous. The vast majority of COs are just normal people, hoping to punch in and punch out without trouble or danger. Like any business, there are bad apples, but for the most part, these guys are not picking fights or beating up inmates for sport. And 2, what our penal system needs more than anything is more mental health resources. The cause would be the first to admit that they aren't equipped to deal with the considerable mental health issues that the incarcerated individuals are dealing with. The security staff and inmates are out in bad spots. The mental health resources just are not there. Story 30. I had a friend. He developed schizophrenia and murdered his 8-year-old sister and his mom when he was in college because he couldn't afford the medicine and, unfortunately, thought he could get by for a couple weeks without it. I was in a jail cell when they brought him in. My friend had blood on him and kept screaming about how their period blood sustained him, and after a few minutes, was rubbing his feces on himself and the walls. He was given medication, stood for trial, and plead insanity, found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He said he didn't remember doing any of it, and medical professionals backed him up on that account. I don't know. Seems like he needs help and not prison, but that's America, I guess. Story 31. I was in holding once when I lived in Philly. Not prison, but man, did I turn my life around. I was picked up for tagging, and the school I went to had a police station instead of a security team. So when I was caught, I was immediately in police custody. They transferred me to the city's holding cell so my mom could bail me out later that day at her discretion. Unfortunately for me, that meant my mother teaching me a lesson first. So I was there entirely longer than I should have been and got a long, hard look at 2 individuals in particular. The first girl to be placed in my cell was a younger black girl, maybe 13, who was pretty tall and thin. Immediately, my mind ran with questions, because what could this girl possibly do to warrant being in jail? After a while of contemplation, she asked me what I was in for, and I eventually found out her only offense was telling the principal to go to hell. We became instant friends and started angrily talking about how messed up her situation was, and how she'll be okay, and hopefully her family would get her out ASAP, before we were actually processed into Gen Pop later that night, as she was, rightly so, terrified and needed reassurance. The second girl was not as innocent, however, and was shoved into our cell in an explosive display, fighting the cops every second of the way. She was a very tiny Asian girl with blood on her face and shoes. The other girl and myself stared openly at her, often looking back and forth in silence, until she calmed down and started crying. We flanked her and offered reassuring words. Patting her on her shoulder, she quietly sniffled. We didn't ask what happened, and by the time we thought we could, she was taken from our cell. Horrified that something may have happened to her, we wrung our hands and wondered aloud about her situation until she finally was led back inside, outright sobbing. We finally asked her what's wrong, and she responds angrily, "I hit my twin sister in the head with a metal pipe, and she's dying in the hospital right now. My dad says if she dies, he's going to let me rot in here. She's the one that threw it at me first." Needless to say, we were both horrified and sat in silence for a few hours, at a loss. Eventually, she opened up that her and her sister had been fighting at home after school, and in the heat of the moment, her sister threw the pipe in question at her. So she picked it up, hit her with it multiple times in the head until she went unconscious, then went into her bedroom to call her boyfriend, changed her shirt, and stayed there until her father came home and found his daughter dying on the floor and the other talking and giggling in her bedroom, covered in blood from the waist down. The entire time she was telling this story, she was cursing her sister, as if she was the one at fault for her actions. Sometime after her story, the cops took her down the hall for a long time. Finally, we see her again as she was walked towards the prison wing in hand ankle cuffs, head hung down, wailing. We never saw her again for the rest of our time in holding, and I have no idea what happened, but I'm positive her sister died that day. Story 32. I spent 27 days in minimum security in Dubai before I was lifted by my country's consulate. It was surreal, seriously boring, except for when it wasn't. Minimum security was run by head inmates. Each wing had 2 chiefs. The wings weren't allowed to mix in general, but when I arrived, they were on good behavior, and the chiefs had negotiated having the wings join, so it was like an open prison. On day 12 of my stay, someone from my wing was accused of stealing from the other wing, and all hell broke loose. The longer-term residents who had been chill were suddenly all over each other. The guy who was accused was basically being lynched and had to be rescued. There was a massive brawl. People had weapons like broom handles and sharpened phone cards. Both wings got locked down. Some people got hospitalized. The wing chiefs had to sort it out to satisfy the corrections officers. They reached a verdict that the accused person would be flogged. Regardless of proving the allegations or not, someone had to be punished. I don't know if the guy actually did anything or not, but 2 days later he was taken outside to the exercise yard and the other inmates whipped him with a cane until he passed out. Then the wings were opened up again, and everything went back to normal. That wasn't as bad, though, as being inside Dubai police station. I was in there for 11 days, waiting to be charged. Each wing of the station has 12 beds. It's not designed for holding people, but there were about 400 people in there. Some of them were on transfer from max to minimum security. Some were waiting for charges. It was a mix of creditors, drug addicts, murderers, with no classification or separation at all. One wing was strictly for collegiate locals, and nowhere near as populated. There was someone in that wing being raped every night. His screams would echo around the whole complex. I don't know how long he was in there for. Some people in that station had been there a long time. Story 33. This was jail, not prison, so sorry if this doesn't count. But when I was there for 3 days, I came in with no shoes. I was bunked with S-400-pound, very feminine man. First thing he said is, "Why are you hiding your feet? You have beautiful feet." I would rub your feet all night. In the middle of the night, the dude asked me if I was masturbating more. Then a few times I wasn't. He constantly hit on me and tried touching me. Last night I was there. He jerked off while I was asleep and carefully put his cum in my hair. I lost my schmidt on him, and I was moved till I went and saw the judge to get released. Story 34. 13 years in state and federal prison here, and indicted under the Federal RICO Act. Seeing people knowing spreading diseases as a form of punishment or attack on other groups of people. Note, I have been free and clear of any supervision for over 4 years now. Without any incidents, none. I changed my life and have never looked back. Story 35. I was never put in prison, but I was in jail a couple of times. The most terrible thing I saw was when I was in jail in New Orleans, about 20 years ago. I was on the psych floor because of my disabilities, done up in leather restraints. One of the normal inmates was a trustee, and for some reason he was on our floor, helping the guards. In the cell next to mine was this one guy, really sick in the head, wouldn't stop screaming. I'll admit he was pissing me off. The trustee kept telling him to shut up, but the guy wouldn't stop. After a little while, the trustee signaled the guards, and they remotely opened the guy's cell door. He went into the cell and proceeded to beat the schmidt out of the poor guy for about 5 to 10 minutes. Now remember, this was the psych floor. The guy was in leather restraints, like me, no way to defend himself. When the trustee came back out, he stopped in front of my cell and asked if I had a problem. Now, I may be disabled, but I'm not stupid. I shook my head and put on a look of fear. They released me a couple days later, and after they took my restraints off, I looked right at the trustee and told him to pray that he never sees me outside. I stopped being afraid of bullies a long time ago, and for just a moment, I got to see his fear. It was very satisfying. Story 36. I went to prison for 2 years in the north of the USA, and the most disturbing thing that I've heard is the no waffle stomping rule. A waffle stomp, FYI, is when someone schmits over a shower drain and clogs by stomping on it. Hence its name. Apparently people did it so much there that made a rule out of it. People are weird. Story 37. True story. One evening after lights out, all of us in the dorm, we asleep or just getting there, when out of nowhere I heard a loud thump against the partition that separated my bed from my neighbor's bed. I was jolted awake, listened, and again, the bang. And again, in faster succession. When I felt my bed shaking slightly from it, I had to sit up in my bunk and peek over the partition to see what was going on. And when I did, it was Doug. He was seated on the bed with his back against our shared partition. He was covered in blood, the cabinet was covered in blood, the bed and the floor was as well. What I heard was his convulsions due to blood loss. I immediately called out to my other cellie to wake up. I said, Chris, hey bro. He looked up over the other partition and I said, bro, Doug's f***ed up. He said, huh? I said, Doug's f***ed up. Soon as I said it the second time, I ran to wake up our other cellies. Iron Horse was the first to go look. He crept over there and seen it too. He ran over and we all stated beating on the door and pressing the button. About 10 seconds of us hitting the door, a quivering old man with a Schmitty mullet, wearing a co-outfit, come to our window and yelled that we get back away from the window. I remember the way he was holding his belt, as if he was ready to pull his 9 if he needed to, but all he had was a little can of pepper spray. He radioed to get our door open and proceeds to go look for himself. Seeing the situation startled him, and he took off out of the dorm yelling on the radio, 1053 medical. Hours later, after they got dug out and cleaned up most of the blood, one of the other co's come over and walked us back into our dorm. We had to wait in the day room. Doug actually survived the attempted suicide. We all got 10 days good time for saving his life. Story 38. The fact that a co can make up a bullshit reason for you to be thrown into solitary confinement for an unspecified amount of time of their choosing. It can be days, weeks, or even months, without knowing when you'll be let back into gin pop. Didn't happen to me, but I know of first-hand accounts. Story 39. There's this thing in jail called Schmidt blasting. The inmate fills a milk carton filled with Schmidt and piss and slips the top underneath your cell door and stomps on it and poof yourself. And cell is covered in Schmidt. Happened to this guy's cell beside me. My room stunk for a week because of how the ventilation system works. Story 40. I worked in psych at a max security prison. I was the one who wrote the notes for the parole board making release suggestions. So, perhaps if people want to be released, they shouldn't tell me all the gory details about how they want to cut my sweet mouth off, then skull me after I'm dead. The scary thing was seeing how often they were released. Story 41. Kitchen staff that would pour dish soap on the extra food after meals. That way people couldn't eat it out of the trash in the back. Other thing is the amount of people who abused psychiatric medications for recreation. Zoloft, Effexor, Lamictal. Cogentin was the worst. People would eat 20 of them and come out to the day room tripping so hard they couldn't remember the last thing they said every time they said anything. Talking about going to their boat and having a conversation with some girl in the chow hall. Getting up and walking a lap around the day room like they were about to go somewhere and then try to go into other people's cells, completely forgetting where they are. And of course, stabbings. Sometimes in the chow hall, and you wouldn't even know what happened. It was so fast, and it just became something everyone talked about for days, like it was something to be hungry about. One kid who just arrived a week prior, stabbed in the face 13 times in the middle of the night. A few cells down from mine, his cellie thought the FBI put him there for monitoring. The look on his face when they pulled him out was haunting. I bumped into him years later, and he said he didn't like talking about it. Story 42. My first day in intake, they take me up to medical and stick me in a waiting room. Yes, the prison doctor makes you wait as well. One dude in the waiting room had a big-ass split in his head that was stitched from his eyebrow to the back of his head. I asked him what happened. He said that he pissed off the wrong dude, who then waited in the corner of his cell for when he came in after work. He then proceeded to hit him over the head with a padlock and a sock. Needless to say, I tried not to pass off the wrong guy. Story 43. Not experienced by me, but I remember seeing a Ross Kemp doco on South African prisons, and one of the gang leaders saying that when a new prisoner is in the cell for their first night, he'd approach them to make them his girlfriend. The line he used was, "There's either going to be blood on my blade or Schmidt on my penis, so make your choice." That has stuck with me for years. Story 44. Haven't been to prison, but know a lot of people who have, and the worst isn't even from prison. It was from the youth detention center. Abductions and rape by staff to the inmates, and some under the age of 12. Absolutely disgusting. Story 45. Not me, but my brother. He was in and out of jail for a few months at a time for a number of reasons. Happy to say he's sober, out of a toxic relationship and thriving now. But I remember the way he described the echo of screams and moans from the mentally ill people in the pitch black was so unnerving. It made me feel sad and terrified all in one, especially since the dark is one of my biggest fears. I spent a few days in a holding cell. I wasn't eating, going to the bathroom, nor was I offered a shower the whole time. I couldn't pass my health exam due to a fever, so I was never moved to Gene Pop. The drunk idiot in the cell next to me screamed for, I swear, the entire 3 days he was in there. Swore up and down he wasn't drunk driving. I'm pretty sure this was very late into New Year's Eve night. And by the way, the officer spoke to him. He was a regular. I couldn't sleep or focus on my book. My Crocs had 32 holes in them, and my cell was 14 and a half bricks long. Story 46. In the jail I was at, the commissary was purchased through a kiosk. The jail charged inmates $3 a day in order to purchase commissary. You had to pay this debt in order to purchase commissary. If you were in debt, you could just put money on another person's account and buy commissary off of that person's account. You usually paid them with a percentage worth of the total order, usually 10-20%. One guy was in debt, we'll call him Jim, and asked another guy, who I'll refer to as Carl, if he could purchase off of his account. Carl agreed, and Jim purchased about $65 of food. Problem was, Carl was beefing with a buddy of mine, Nick. Nick threatened to beat the Schmidt out of him. Carl felt threatened and asked the police if he could leave the unit. This meant that Jim's order would go to the wrong unit and Carl wouldn't be able to give it to him. Never in my life have I seen an entire group of people direct so much wrath on one person. Carl had to lock himself in his cell because Nick and everyone else made threats on his life. Most troubling was my buddy Terry's threats. "That's on my kids. I'm gonna find you and end your goddamn life. I'm about that whole life. You're a slam. I'm coming after you." The whole pod had to be locked down. Carl left the pod to a chorus of curses and threats, most of which to his family and life. Story 47. I was imprisoned for a few months in Brixton Prison, London. My cell was at the end of the oldest wing of the prison, built in 1836. One night in the early hours, I was awoken by a noise outside my cell. It was the noise of a guard walking by and sounded like he was banging his truncheon on the rails outside my door, like a kid does along a fence with a stick. It was really irritating, and I got out on my bunk and looked onto the landing through the porthole in my door, and to see which one of the idiots it was. I was surprised to see that there was nobody outside on the landing, though I could still hear the stick knocking. Next morning, I mentioned this to some fellow prisoners, a couple of whom had also heard what I had. An officer nearby heard us and said, "Oh, that'll be old John up to his usual tricks." He went on to explain that old John was prison guard who loved to wake prisoners by banging his nightstick along the landing rails, just to irritate them. Old John had been murdered by a prisoner in 1889. The officer went on to explain that when they hear old John is about, they stay firmly in their landing office until the noise is finished. Story 48. UK here was in a YOI, young offenders institution, ages from 18 to 21, piss-poor living conditions, defenseless individuals mixed with predators everywhere. I watched 3 guys spend hours at their cell doors shouting through to another guy in his cell about everything they were going to do to him. He's worthless and pathetic and should just end it all. That resulted in him actually making an attempt on his life. Things like that were actually so common that I can't tell you whether he survived or not. I don't recall who did and who didn't. I witnessed around 8 separate hostage situations, the worst being 2 guys kidnapping a random victim and holding him ransom in an attempt to get moved to a prison closer to their homes. This wasn't uncommon, as a lot of guys would be located hundreds of miles away from family and never received visitation because of it. However, in this instance, both guys lost their focus and began to torture and humiliate their victim, who was chosen at random and had done nothing to either of them. He was in fact a quiet and humble guy. They tied him to a chair and then positioned him on the top bunk, telling the negotiator at the cell door that if they make an attempt to breach the cell, then they would cut him and pull him off the top bunk to plummet 6 feet face first into concrete. They ended up stripping him, making him sing humiliating songs, and defiled all of his personal belongings, pictures, and letters from home. I watched one guy force another guy to kiss his feet in the showers over literally nothing. When the guy quite rightly refused, he was rushed by about 5 of them and beaten quite bad. The amount of Schmidt you see is unreal. The amount you hear about is completely unbelievable. But you can bet that there's an element of truth to everything. I could list off story after story after story. I probably don't even recall the very worst cases right now. Story 49. A guard raping a woman in her cell, the whole while telling her that he didn't even find her attractive, and that no one would believe her due to how ugly she was. Conveniently, the camera footage for that night was lost, like so many others. Story 50. A guy tried to hang himself in the max wing. Officers barely got to him in time, and only did because a couple of cells were able to trigger the fire alarm by powdered coffee whitener into the smoke alarms. Story 51. I spent nearly 12 years in prison in the state of Florida. From 18 to 29, I seen some whack-ass Schmidt. From a guy they called the Jacksonville rapist, he would cut the pockets out of his pants and tie strings to his penis and jack off in front of the gun towers at Okaloosa High. Then one time, these 2 little greasy white boys got in a fight. They went at it for a couple minutes, and when they were done, there was a small turd laying on the floor. Neither of them would cop to it. Hysterical. Then I'll leave you with this. I came around the corner in a dorm at Cross City, and I see a guy I had some respect for on all fours, taking a country mile of BBC. I was like, whoa. Turned and headed a different direction. I catch up with homie later, and I'm like, what F? What are you going through? He said he just wanted to feel what it was like. Those are just a couple. Story 52. I was in jail, not prison, overnight, and inmates like to talk. The lady I shared a cell with told that a man had keeks with her daughter and gave her Instead. I don't remember the child's exact age, but it was under 10. Story 53. My little brother was in prison for 12 years. Drugs are easier to get there than outside of it, but cost a lot more. It cost me literally thousands of dollars, because he'd get in debt to some guys for getting drugs, and then he'd be like, if you don't pay them, they're gonna beat me up. I didn't pay one time because I had wasted thousands. Like I said, $200 here, $300 here, and this happened weekly. And he sent me a pic, nearly unrecognizable. Told him he should probably stop using. He got clean after that for just a while. The entire thing is just a sad, miserable story. There's less rehabilitation that happens in prison than networking and plans getting made on what to do when they get out to make money, illegally. Story 54. Never been to prison, but was in a juvenile facility in Brooklyn for a bit. Besides the constant fighting and nonsense going on, I vividly remember one of the JC strike a kid on the head with the key they used to pop open the units. The key was about 12 inches and pretty bulky. Right away, the kid grabbed his head and we all saw blood gushing out. The guy grabbed the kid and tried to hide him from the cameras and told him and everyone else to stay quiet about the incident. I was about 15 seeing this and have never trusted ACS or DOJ from that point on. Story 55. I've never been in prison, but my dad was a corrections officer in an Arizona prison in the 90s. He told me this story, and it still makes me cringe. He was an overnight officer, and he got a call to come to the infirmary to witness an injury and make a statement. I'm assuming the prisoner was mentally ill, or maybe on something to do this. The prisoner had taken a pen or a pencil, used it to drill cut a hole at the base of his penis and into his urethra. Then he somehow ran a string through the hole, up the urethra, out the tip, and then tied the two ends of the string together. He told me this 25 plus years ago, and it still makes me shiver just thinking about it. Story 56. Not me, my uncle. He told me when he was in prison, and he had a cellmate that would always wet the bed. The other inmates would make fun of him, laugh at him for it, bully him. One day, my uncle asked him, his cellmate, why he didn't just stand up and go to the bathroom. The toilet was literally in the same room. He told my uncle that he couldn't control it, and that he's been doing it since he was a young kid. My uncle was so confused that a grown man was still wetting the bed. A few days later, somehow, he was talking to one of the prison guards, and the topic of the bedwetter cellmate came up. The prison guard told him that he heard from other inmates and prison guards that he was sexually assaulted by his older brother as a young kid, and that bedwetting was one of the signs results of being sexually assaulted. My uncle never brought up the topics of bedwetting and SA around his cellmate ever again. Story 57. I used to be a correctional officer for a few years. Not my proudest moments. I guess the most crazy things besides drugs and what people will do to get them shove up ass or vagina, or throw up and someone will eat their puke for some honey buns so they can get the meds they just took, is the amount of self-harm. I've witnessed hangings, some dead, some not. Hanging from sink or bunk with bedsheet or once of the top tier. I've had guys cut throat in front of me and arms the Ling way. I've broken up an attempted rape. Way more than that too. And this was in a small state in what most people call a daycare, I guess. I can't imagine bigger states with a larger gang presence. We had small fights, but nothing crazy. Mostly self-harm. Story 58. I heard a disturbing story from a guard that was a client of mine. He was telling me about inmates at the prison he worked at, complaining about hearing loud screams from an animal at night, and they couldn't figure out what it was or whose cell it was coming from. The guards did their regular checks, and they kept coming up empty. The guards waited one night until they heard the screams and followed the sounds back to where they thought it was coming from. Apparently, a house cat wandered into the prison yard and an inmate snuck it into the cells. The sounds that the guards were hearing were screams from animal, but they were so loud that it was unrecognizable. The guards finally found where the sounds were coming from and followed them back to one of their sickest inmates. He was hiding that house cat that got into the prison in his bunk. The night that they found the cat screaming was when they found the inmate forcing the cat onto his penis. The guard was describing the incident as a visual that is permanently tattooed in my mind. Story 59. I've unfortunately done a few years inside, and I can list a wide range of disturbing schmidt I've seen. The one that gets me the most was a guy got kicked off Suboxone and went on a protest. Later that day, he was in the isolation tank they have on our units to keep the person until they go to the slot, isolation, HIU. Well, this guy wasn't having that, so he decided to not only smear his feces schmidt all over the cell and himself, but decided to take a huge bite of it. That made the majority of us who could see from our cell and the screws involved gag and vomit. And that is what is my worst incident to witness. I've seen stabbings and slashing, PPL being stomped on and whatnot, but that schmidt is just nasty. This was the jail I was in, and this was some of the schmidt that would happen. Story 60. I got hired as a guard at the local jail. Showed up to the first day, ready and willing to learn. The guy that is giving me the tour turns to me and says to bring lots of ramen. I was confused. I asked why, and he told me it's to pay the women for keks, whatever you like. I walked out and never looked back. I'm no hero, but that was way too much. Keks for a pack of ramen. Story 61. Heard a story from a good friend who is a Christian missionary. He was in a foreign country, I can't remember where, but it was on an island in the Pacific Ocean. While he was there, he was at the local prison to help out with the ministry. During one sermon, he sat next to a prisoner whom kept asking him questions about the sermon. Halfway through their conversation, he asked the prisoner why he was there in prison. The reason? Cannibalism. Scared my friend to death because that guy seemed pretty normal to him. My brother had a similar story from when he was in jail for a DUI. While he was waiting to be bailed out, he got to talking to a guy in there who seemed friendly. Eventually, the conversation got around to why they were there, and the guy just casually says that he beat up his GF because she wouldn't leave the house. Story 62. Not prison, but jail. We made a hookup with like 20 noodles and 20 chips, and the bag busted open onto the floor, right by the toilet and underneath it. These two dudes that were next door to our cell said don't throw it out, and came running back with spoons and literally started scooping it into their bowls and eating it. My cellmate and the other two dudes that were cooking with us all just sat there saying, "Y'all are naked. We can literally give y'all some off. The new one, don't eat that schmidt," and they just adamantly insisted they were okay with it. People really hit their lowest in there. Another time, this kid was given 3 noodles to lick the shower drain. Just disgusting. Those are the people we call send-offs. Story 63. Several inmates heated up petroleum jelly. Some of it got thrown on the floor to mess with codes. Some of it got thrown in one inmate's face. Then 4 guys grabbed him and stabbed him in the head, chest, and neck repeatedly. Story 64. Holding cell in Thailand. No beds. Concrete floor. Open cells with a squat toilet at the end. Water would run into all the cells from the toilet. Slept in board shorts, singlet, and had my thongs as a pillow. 1 bowl of rice for lunch and dinner. There was almost a fight over a fried egg I got first day because I was paying to get out early. So they gave me a fried egg too. I gave that egg up so fast because all I wanted was my freedom. The cell bars were so rusted you could pull them apart, but nobody did because nobody wanted to die from being shot by a guard. There was another dude shackled to the middle of the floor in old school iron rings, and the rest of us, about 20, 30, hugging the perimeter of the cells like we didn't want to get bit by a wild animal. Story 65. First night, me and my cellie both first time in prison. The first night, we got thrown into level 3 cells. We wake up in the morning, looking out of the door glass, and the guy across from us was a lifer, and they just stuck a new guy in with him. Well, overnight he killed him and flushed 70% of him down the toilet. It was that moment neither of us said anything. Just the look I saw on his face, and probably the same luckies on mine, was enough to say everything. Story 66. The worst I witnessed firsthand was the guy that hit his cellie's finger, even though he only had a few teeth, or the guy that killed his cellie, cut off his head, removed an eye, and wrote all over the walls in the guy's blood. Story 67. It is hard to think of what wasn't disturbing, but try this. 200 men in a building. The educational counselor posts the names of high school graduates and guys with a GED. There were only 3 names out of the 200. My experience was more than 35 years ago in dormitory setting in a rural southern prison. Story 68. Jail, not prison. Nothing too crazy. This guy who was there on child molestation charges would jerk off in his pants while sitting at the lunch table all the time. He would just be watching the TV or having a conversation and secretly beating his penis at the same time. He got called out a lot. He got beat up a lot. Story 69. My issued bedroll, which usually has a couple sheets, was all pillowcases. Really like 5 pillowcases. I laid them down across the mattress, but they moved around during the night. So I sweated where the plastic wafer mattress touched me. Story 70. I haven't been in prison, but there was this news here in Mexico this month about a prison near where I live, where they found a dead baby in a dumpster. It gets worse though. The baby had a bracelet with his surname, 2 surnames since it's Mexico, and the parents found out. It was a baby that died a month ago and someone dug his grave up and took the baby to the prison, apparently to smuggle drugs in. When the parents went to the graveyard, they were threatened not to contact the authorities. Apparently some graveyards in Mexico City are subject to people who dig graves and sell bones in the black market for people who practice Santeria. Story 71. I've been a correctional officer for the better part of 5 years. Anyways, a guy smoked some schmidt and went nuts, so we put him on constant supervision, and at some point, using on the frame of the bed area, he tore off his testicles and then quickly gouged his eyes. Story 72. I worked for the U.S. Marshals, and when walking a fugitive down the cell block, a few dudes insisted on exposing themselves to me and another female officer. The look on this one dude's face in particular was a face I can never forget. There was just something about his eyes that screamed evil to me. The others were perv, sure, but this dude would have worn my skin like last season's Versace. Story 73. We had out time for maybe 10 minutes a day. Doors automatic. Guy walks out. Door next to me on second level. Hangs himself with his blanket. Feel down a story and proceeds to flop around like a fish. Saw a guy get beat with a lock and sock. Was forced to work nonstop with no break for 3 days until I started collapsing. Was instantly confined to solitary because I appealed a judge. Got out for 1 shower a week. Had to drink toilet water. PSTD like a mofo, LOL. Story 74. I was locked up with a guy who was a kex offender. 3 guys had knocked him out in his 2-person cell. The 3 guys then took his mattress, lit it on fire, and threw it on top of him. The guy lived through it, but lost most of both his arms and lots of his face. Story 75. Family friend worked as a prison guard. She told me there was an inmate, a little person who was being very, very difficult for a few days. He made some wise-ass comment or something when they were moving him, so the guards threw his little ass down the stairs. I guess it messed him up pretty bad. She was not sorry at all, and laughed the entire time she told us about it. Story 76. Was a guard in a maximum security prison. Saw a child rapist get raped himself every day until he hung himself. Saw a guy get his head stomped so much that brain matter was coming out of his ears. Saw a dude get raped to death with a broken broomstick. Saw a guy on death row who had acquired a sharp razor, cut from his neck down to the bottom of his stomach, and pull his guts out and tried to throw them through the cell bars. Those are just a few of many. Story 77. Worked in a jail for a short time. At intake, they had a guy stripped and isolated because he was riding high. Well, someone missed a piercing and he used it to open a vein. He danced around as his blood flew in the air. Took 5 men to restrain and help him not die. Another dude had enough after 3 years of the Pod M, so he covered himself in his own poop, barricaded his cell and said, "Come and get me. God's the Snell." Story 78. In women's prison, inmates who are girlfriends cut each other while having keeks and suck each other's blood. Also, I've seen people swallow drugs in visitation, then not be able to throw up after, and have to wait to schmitt their drugs out. They schmitt into a bag, then dig through their schmitt to get the drugs. Disgusting, but happens all the time. Ha 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 ha. Story 79. I saw a man die from lack of medical attention. He was a diabetic being processed at an intake facility in Texas. They wouldn't give him medicine. He passed out and they put him in a holding cage in the sun for about 30 minutes to wait for an escort to medical. Story 80. A guy describing in detail how he shot his housemate, then went to the hardware store to buy an angle grinder to cut him up, put him in a bag, and threw off a boat. He was only caught after the guy's head washed up on a beach and was found by a kid. He told us in a very deadpan way, he's doing life. Story 81. I used to hear these 2 guys daily talk about how much paraphernalia they brought back from work release in their ass. Just the way they talked about it so casually, and these dudes were only in there for child support. The one guy got caught because he had a heroin needle break apart up in there. Story 82. Never been to prison, but my buddy is a co and has tons of stories. The one kept me thinking and wondering was a video of an inmate alive, and soon later, he was cut in half and dumped in a trash can without being in any security footage. Story 83. Was in jail in Nassau County in early 1999, and the correction officers beat an inmate to death. They all went down for it. Around the same time, they locked up a con artist who was using fraud to try to buy the NY Islanders.